A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for connecting for today's Green Talk Live. I'm Kumi Kitamori, Deputy Director at the OECD Environment Directorate. And today our topic is regulating water services, a critical factor for mobilizing investment. And we are doing this today on this topic to mark the upcoming World Water Day that's on 22nd of March. And today we'll discuss how strong economic regulation can contribute to mobilizing investment for water. Effective economic regulation for water services shapes how water and wastewater services are priced, operated, and financed. Strong regulatory framework also helps protect users, ensure sustainable service provision, and also create the right conditions to attract the much needed investment. This year, 2026, is a bit of a landmark year for the global water policy community as we prepare for the UN Water Conference to take place this coming December in Abu Dhabi. This important international milestone builds on the foundation established at the previous UN Water Conference back in 2023, and also as a stepping stone as we head to the 2028 UN Water Conference in Tajikistan. Now, water will also prominently feature this year. It's a triple COP year this year, 26, taking place all this year for the three Rio Conventions on climate change, biodiversity, and on desertification. But unfortunately, we are way off track in achieving SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation by 2030, and that's only less than 4 years to go. In particular with investments in water lagging behind other sectors. Now, in recent work, the World Bank estimates that up to $7 trillion of investment is needed to achieve SDG 6 and broader water security by 2030. For water and sanitation services alone, investments are needed to expand access and treatment capacity, for upgrading of aging infrastructure and to address pollution, particularly from contaminants of emerging concerns such as PFAS, also known as forever chemicals in our water. Now, strengthening economic regulation of water and sanitation services is a critical factor in enabling investments in these services so that they can be provided sustainably and efficiently, not only for household users, but also industry and agriculture. Now, improved economic regulation can also help secure revenue streams, for example, including through tariffs, and improve service quality through better monitoring and fostering improved performance. Now, this in turn creates stability and confidence that investors need and to facilitate finance mobilization. Now, at the OECD, we have the OECD Council recommendation on water, and this is a legal instrument that provides high-level policy guidance on key dimensions related to water management and delivery. And this OECD Council recommendation addresses also aspects related to regulation, and the recommendation is to really separate out clearly the roles and responsibility for water policy making, policy implementation, operational management, and regulations, while also fostering coordination across different responsible authorities. Now, with this, all this brings us to this topic of today's Green Talk Live, where we will explore approaches to strengthen water regulations. And I'm very pleased to introduce Sophie Tremolet. She's a water OECD, and she will present some key findings from recent OECD work on the economic regulation of water services. And she will also highlight trends in institutional models, as well as some remaining knowledge gaps. And we'll also hear from her some insights from her work in the context of what we call the National Policy Dialogue on Water, including with the Philippines and with Senegal on progress in reforming regulatory arrangements. And following Sophie's presentation, we'll hear from two very exciting discussants. I'm very happy to introduce Maria Salvetti. She is the head of water and waste area from Florence School of Regulations, and also Madeleine Portman. She's a deputy head of water and sanitation department from Agence Française de Développement. Very well, welcome to Maria and Madeleine, and also Sophie, all our speakers today. And so they will share their views on recent evolution with economic regulation in this sector, water sector, and also its importance in facilitating, attracting, and mobilizing investment in the sector. And after we hear from all discussants, then we will open the floor for open Q&A discussion. And I encourage everybody to put your questions and participate. You can use the Zoom function, which is a chat function at the bottom of your screen. I hope you can see that. And you are welcome to put in your question throughout the entire duration of the event, and then we'll come to you and we try to address as many questions as we can in the time allocated. So without further ado, I would like to pass on the floor to Sophie for her presentation. Over to you.
Many thanks, Kumi, for this introduction. I will now share my screen so that you can all see my presentation. Okay. Good. So as Kumi mentioned, we're going to have a framing presentation, and part of the purpose of this presentation is also to provide a sort of basic understanding and common understanding of what is economic regulation, as some of you may be more or less familiar with that concept. We will then look at OECD work in the area, past work, but also recent work with forthcoming publications, which are coming out later in the year. To give you a preview and a taste for these, some of these activities, we will present some key findings from a forthcoming OECD working paper, but also from work that we've carried out on the ground, as Kumi mentioned, in the Philippines, in Senegal, and also to some extent what we're currently doing in Latvia. And then as a conclusion, I will give you a highlight of recommendations coming out of this work and what we identified as next steps. So the economic regulation can be construed as a framework to ensure sustainable service provision, help protect users, and attract investment. As with other natural monopolies such as energy or telecoms, it's usually deemed necessary to have an economic regulation framework in place. Because they are natural monopolies, but also because they are essential services nobody can do without water, and they generate a number of externalities, particularly on the environment and on human health. So usually economic regulation is construed as being focused on tariffs and service quality, but there are also a number of important functions that I will go into more detail in, which are essential for having a comprehensive framework. What is important to bear in mind is that this is not only about enforcing rules and standards defined in law, decrees, or a legal framework. It requires from the entity carrying out such regulation flexibility so that they can balance a number of key regulatory principles, which include efficiency, sustainability, and equity. But it also requires, of course, predictability. We mentioned the importance of attracting investments because investors want to know that they can see the path that tariffs will take over time, or they want to have clear frameworks in order to deliver services, clear KPIs, for example, for this delivery. So this is the first point. The second point is that we are talking here about economic regulation, which is usually conducted separately from health and environmental regulation. Environmental regulation, for example, consists of defining and enforcing pollution standards, abstraction charges, and abstraction regimes, whereas health regulation is mostly focused on drinking water. However, we're seeing some evolution in this area, and that's one of the exciting developments that we wanted to discuss. So just to go a little bit further in terms of what economic regulation is, As mentioned, there are a number of functions that make up economic regulation. Tariff regulation usually consists of defining tariff setting methodologies, developing tariff setting models, and that requires collecting a lot of data. Some regulators or regulatory mechanisms are looking at setting tariffs, both tariff levels and structures, but not all. You heard from the recommendation that it's best to separate regulation from policy making. Sometimes tariff setting and is in the purview of policy makers. We also have an important function that is service quality regulation. Again, it requires collecting a lot of data, but also defining and tracking KPIs for the quality of service delivered to customers. And a key tool in order to perform service quality regulation is usually benchmarking to compare the performance of different operators, either at national level or at international level. Of some of the functions that are less well understood or less prominent are here on the right: consumer protection, which is excessively important and sometimes a driver for reforming regulatory arrangements. So that would include customer consultation, but also the handling of complaints and the publication of information so as to ensure maximum transparency in the regime. And then for competition, this is because many water sectors are fragmented, so we need to ensure that there are a common ground for operating in the sector. And there are some instruments that regulators can award, such as licenses, which are, for example, applicable for on-site sanitation. And in some cases, regulators are also asked to resolve conflicts and are given the power to apply sanctions. I mentioned here regulators, but what we're going to see later is that there are a variety of regulatory regimes. So this is a catch-all formula, but it's not always independent agencies. So the OECD has been working for many years on the regulation of water services across many parts of our institution, what we call directorates, such as END Directorate, where I sit, the Environment Directorate, but also our colleagues within the Governance Directorate or colleagues working on cities and decentralization issues. As we are an economic institution, a lot of our work is focused on economic instruments, on governance, but also convening regulators through, for example, the network of economic regulators, which goes beyond water to include all sorts of economic regulators. We're seeing recently quite a strong demand from countries to strengthen their regulatory arrangements, to attract investment ultimately, which is why, in collaboration with the Agence Française de Développement, we prepared a working paper, which is expected to be published in May 2026, in which we looked at recent developments in economic regulation of water supply and sanitation services, particularly in developing countries, but we have many examples of what has happened in developed countries as well, which are highly relevant for all our members and our partner countries. So this report looks at institutional models for regulation, but also at how to address social and territorial inequalities and addressing environmental challenges. I will go into further detail on how this works. We've also carried out some work at country level at the request of governments who are looking to reform their regulatory regimes. We're seeing a common trend in Senegal and the Philippines, where both countries are looking to transition to a single regulatory agency so as to foster investment. They're moving away from regulation by contract to this kind of regime. And in a number of countries, we're seeing the need for these reforms being carried out in parallel with sector consolidation, which is another key ingredient for generating efficiency gains and giving stability and attractiveness to investors. So I mentioned these different institutional models of regulation. We categorize them in three categories. So one is self-regulation, in which the public operator, most of the time, is largely autonomous, while the state or the municipality that typically owns the asset has relatively limited control. So the onus is on the regulator to self-regulate in the benefit of the public. So we've got a very good example of this documented in the working paper, which is Eau de Paris in France, a regime that has evolved over time with greater scrutiny from the municipality, but which has really a democratic contract that enables them to deliver what the public is expected. We then have quite a large number of countries that have entered into regulation by contract. They do so mostly when there is private sector participation, but it doesn't have to be. And the contract is the instrument that binds the owner of the asset and the operator that is operating these assets. So the contracts define the objectives that need to be met, but also investment obligations, tariff setting mechanisms, performance indicators, etc. So we have an interesting example of regulation by contract in Senegal, which has been in place since 1996. It was always cited as a very strong regulation by contract, but which has been meeting with some weaknesses more recently due to a lack of transparency and also an inability to maintain tariffs at a level that enables cost recovery. There's also been an increase in the number of operators, which means that we received this demand from the Senegalese government to foster the creation of a single regulatory agency, a decision that has been taken at the very top of the Senegalese government by the president himself. The third type of model, therefore, is regulatory agencies, where regulators, which are autonomous to some degree from the political powers, have a number of regulatory functions very much aligned with the functions that I outlined in the previous slide. And these can be regulating only certain operators, as we see in the Philippines for Manila. There are two operators in the capital city of Manila, or operating at national level, such as in Portugal or in England and Wales, of what has been often cited as the key reference for regulatory agencies, but is now likely to evolve and maybe disappear because of increased criticism of the performance of a regulatory regime in England and Wales. So, but what we have seen over the years is a gradual increase in the number of regulatory agencies. This was based on a survey of water regulators carried out by the OECD back in 2015. We don't have more recent numbers, but we know that there have been an increase in the number of regulatory agencies. So one of the first questions we asked in the working paper is whether we can trace back the regulatory models to the performance. However, what we identified through an extensive literature review is that there is no statistically reliable survey to benchmark the performance of different institutional regulatory models. So the working paper took the approach of a series of case studies to investigate what is the performance of these different models. And what we found is that the choice of regulatory model depends on the context and the specific regulatory needs. So that self-regulation takes place in contexts where services are managed by public entities and where these entities have strong capacities, so they have the ability to regulate themselves. This is not often the case, which is why we often need either regulation by contract or the creation of regulatory authorities. And regulatory authorities are typically created where transparent and independent oversight is needed to ensure service quality and sustainability. The paper then looked at two key questions. The first one is how it can help address territorial and social inequalities. There's a lot on this slide, but it's basically stating that yes, economic regulation can do a lot in this area, particularly through tariff structure, even though one of the key recommendations of the OECD is to state that social tariffs should be kept independent, or social policies should be kept independent from tariff setting. So it's usually preferable to have dedicated subsidies and to minimize the tinkering of water tariffs to achieve social goals. But what we found is that regulation is also important to be thought through and to accompany a process of consolidation, because a lot of territorial inequalities often stems from high degrees of fragmentation of water sectors. So regulation can help foster aggregation of of service delivery so as to generate efficiency gains. Another area where social inequalities is highly at play is that of sanitation regulation. And we found and documented interesting examples in the working paper where regulation by contract or through licenses has incentivized the operators to provide better and more extensive sanitation services, either through sewage network extension, that's the case in Manila, for example, or through mandatory pit emptying when it's on-site sanitation mostly at play. So there are ways of strengthening sanitation regulation to address social inequalities, given that most of the time it's poor people who don't get access to sanitation services. Last but not least, we looked at how economic regulation can help address environmental challenges. And there we have identified a number of cases where regulation by contract is putting much more emphasis on environmental goals. For example, for water conservation, through performance indicators to reduce water losses, or regulation by agency can also have a strong role to support investment in nature-based solutions and the introduction of payment for ecosystem services. So all of these are documented in the working paper. I will then briefly look at the example of the Philippines. As I mentioned to you, we are getting demand from countries because, as in the case is in the Philippines, we have very fragmented water sectors. So in the Philippines, we have 28,000 water service providers and different categories of economic regulation by type of water service providers. As a result, access to finance and funding is a challenge, whilst achieving the SDG 6.1, 6.2 will cost about $18 billion by 2030. So this undermines efficiency, equity, and quality. So some of the recommendations that we formulated is to create with a single independent economic regulator in order to improve the quality of regulation. This is something that the Philippines government has been considering for some time. It won't happen overnight, so interim arrangements need to be in place. And for that, it's important to have a more unified tariff and water quality framework to be defined based on consistent principles and practices, including the provision of incentives, harmonization of tariff setting approaches, or improvement in data collection and harmonization. So in summary, I would say that many countries are at a pivotal moment where they identified the need to reform water sanitation services regulatory frameworks to accelerate the achievements of the SDGs, meet expectations of reducing inequalities, or face increasingly complex and costly environmental challenges. As we said, there's no one size fits all in terms of institutional models. There's a lot of lessons emerging, particularly in how to tackle social and environmental challenges. So there's a strong need for lesson sharing and peer-to-peer learning in those areas. And what we have identified as a key need and key gap for further research is that we need more robust benchmarking to compare regulatory models and guide reforms, and also inform the design of transition arrangements from one system to another, which is absolutely key in the context of reforms. So thank you very much. You have my email here, and I'll hand back the floor to Kumi.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for your in the scene for the discussions to come. Now I would like to invite Maria Salvetti to be our at Florence School of Regulation, and she has ample examples and experience working with governments to help them assess and also design regulatory arrangements. So Maria, maybe I could start with a first question to you. So can you share your insights on the incorporation of environmental aspects into regulation and on current trends that you see in regulatory reform? from your experience, what are some of the ways to incorporate environmental concerns into economic regulation?
Well, thank you very much, Kumi, and very happy, obviously, to be here with you. To answer your question, well, I will just pick some examples that I have seen in the practices of mainly of regulatory agencies. But some of the examples they also apply to arrangements such as regulation by contract, as well as potentially self-regulation. So, for instance, KPIs, which can be embedded into a contract and therefore be part of regulation by contract, but KPIs that can also be used by regulators are, let's say, a good way to include some environmental concerns into the work of the regulators and the work of regulation. For instance, some regulators are using KPIs to monitor energy neutrality as well as climate neutrality. So going way beyond the mere energy efficiency, really going beyond with energy neutrality, meaning the self-production of energy and self-consumption of energy, either in wastewater services, but also potentially in water services as well. There is also some regulators, and I'm thinking about the Irish regulator of utilities that is monitoring climate neutrality with the greenhouse gas emissions that are being monitored on a regular basis. So this is really one of the tools, but what I have seen as well is that those KPIs, for those KPIs, the regulators are not setting any targets. So it's merely, let's say, monitoring rather than setting stringent targets that utilities would have to comply with. Another tool that some regulators are using is to embed into the tariff methodology some components which are reflecting environmental costs and resource cost as well. This is the case for ARERA, which is the Italian water regulator. ARERA also has a regulatory power and mandate for other sectors, but it does regulate, obviously, the water sector. And ARERA, for a few regulatory cycles, has embedded into the tariff methodology some components reflecting environmental and resource costs. In Denmark, most recently, I've seen that the regulator, which is using a revenue cap, is sometimes allowing utilities to increase a little bit this revenue cap if the utilities can prove that they want to collect extra money, extra revenues, specifically to fund a project for climate change adaptation, for instance, or for groundwater preservation. So really adapting actually the revenue cap and the revenue ceiling to some very specific projects. And last but not least, that the last example that I wanted to share, to go a bit beyond, the EU frontiers, and to mention SUNAS in Peru, so the water regulator in Peru that is allowing utilities to collect through their revenues and through the tariff, the invoice that is being paid by the consumers, to collect a share of the tariff that will be used to fund payment for environmental services, and therefore trying to modify, for instance, farming practices upstream that could produce some pollution into the raw water. So I'll stop there with these examples, but very happy, to go deeper if there are any questions during the Q&A.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And these, examples from the ground from different countries really brings to life what we've been discussing. Maybe just very quick follow-up questions. So, you already talked about different tools that's been used exactly to incorporate these environmental aspects into economic regulations. But do you see any kind of evolution, if you will, evolution in these institutional models and tools that could inspire going forward further regulatory reform in these countries or in other countries?
Yeah, actually, as Sophie was mentioning, in the water sector, when we talk about regulation, there is economic regulation, environmental regulation, health regulation, which are key areas of regulation. And most of the time, we're following some of the OECD principles on water governance. We say that there is a need for coordination between these three areas of regulation. And what I'm seeing is that sometimes in some countries, the trend is to go beyond coordination and going into integration of some of these areas. So Sophie mentioned the future of OFWAT that might be of integrating actually the Drinking Water Inspectorate, OFWAT, and a share of the functions of the Environment Agency. So there seems to be a full integration of these three areas of regulation specifically for water supply and sanitation services. In Senegal, on which I've had the opportunity to work with the OECD, the Senegal is thinking of setting up a regulatory authority for the water sector that is in charge of regulating both the water tariff. So really looking at water supply and sanitation services, but also the instruments to economically regulate water resource management. So having the same entity being in charge of water abstraction charges and water pollution charges. So there we have an integration of those two areas, which are economic regulation of water resource management and economic regulation of water supply and sanitation. So in other countries, and I'll finish by that, in Portugal, some functions of regulation regarding the control of the quality of the drinking water are embedded into ERSA, which is the economic regulator for water and wastewater services. So we see emerging as a push, let's say, towards integration rather than only strengthening the coordination.
No, thank you so much for that. A lot of great insights from different countries. Let us move on to next panelist. But before that, maybe I just want to remind everybody listening in, tuning in to please send your questions through the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Okay, now let us turn to Madeleine. Madeleine Portman, she's a Deputy Head of Water and Sanitation, Agence Française de Développement. So for your work at ADF, you're leading, it's a leading bilateral development bank of France. And then we know that your organization has quite a bit of, important and growing portfolio of water and sanitation sector investments, and also other water security type of investments. So maybe based on that, can you tell us how you take account of this regulatory framework for water and sanitation services when you're assessing potential investment project?
Yeah, thank you for this question, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss with you today. So first, I want to stress out that at AFD, we don't promote one specific regulatory model over another. So what really matters to us is that the framework can deliver in practice on the objectives of SDG 6. Our focus is really on outcomes, so financial sustainability, service performance, and accountability towards users. So in practice, there are two main ways in which we take into account regulation when we assess our financings. First, you have to know that all of our projects go through what we call a sustainable development analysis framework. So, well, this is a big word to say that there is some kind of independent team within AFD who assesses how the financing benefits or not the sector. So it's institutions, it's financial sustainability. So governance is a key pillar of this analysis. And in fact, all of our projects get rated from -2 to +3, depending on whether they have, according to this team, negative or positive co-benefits in terms of institutional effectiveness and financial balance. So even if it's indirect, I would say that regulation is systematically part of this assessment. And let's just say we could not go to our board and present a project that would have received a negative rating with regard to governance and regulation. So this is the first way. And the second way, I don't know if you know, but at AFD and also our subsidiary for private sector, Proparco, we sometimes finance directly utilities or operators with no state guarantee. So we bear the credit risk of these utilities. For example, we do so in the water and sanitation sector in Brazil or in Turkey. And so when we do so, we carry out a full credit analysis, which is very similar to what rating agencies like Standard & Poor's or Moody's would do. And in that case, of course, the regulatory environment is absolutely central because it affects the creditworthiness of the operator. So we look at the tariff setting rules, at the predictability, the cost recovery mechanisms, and overall sector governance. So yeah, this is mainly how we take into account this topic in our investment appraisal.
Thank you, Madeleine. So, with the many projects and programs that ADF is running, how do you typically include in your project, mostly investment project, but support for strengthening these regulatory arrangement? And if you're doing that, then how do you do that? You also already mentioned that some of this creditworthiness assessment includes this kind of regulatory aspect, but how do you do that in terms of supporting further strengthening?
Okay. So in fact, there are, I would say, various options depending on also, the willingness of our local partners, because obviously there has to be some kind of request from the country we are financing to have us working on this with us. But at the very least, what we can do at the very least is to finance studies alongside our project or alongside the infrastructure we support to spark dialogue on the regulatory environment of the sector. So this is something we do, in fact, very frequently. We recently did so in Ivory Coast, where we financed a quite modest study, but which was, I find, very insightful on how the sector's governance and regulatory functions could be strategically improved. So I don't know if you know Ivory Coast, but the current regulatory framework has had important results in the past, but there are many challenges. The ONEP, which is the Office National de l'Eau Potable, concentrates many roles, regulatory functions, asset management responsibilities. So it's quite difficult to have a fully independent oversight. And also there are many, financial economic constraints with tariff setting, which is very centralized at the state level. So when we financed this study, it was a way for us to spark a discussion with the government and other financial partners. And I think it did so. So that this is the first level, I would say. If we go one step further, we can also directly support the dialogue itself. So this was mentioned by Sophie earlier, but in Senegal, AFD supported through a grant a national policy dialogue in partnership with the OECD on several topics, including water sector reform and how to maybe create a dedicated regulator. So I will not go into this because it was already mentioned before. And maybe a third option, which we could envisage, and which is maybe the most advanced, is to support the implementation of regulatory reforms through policy-based financing. So a good example of that is what we did in Mauritius, where we financed a policy-based loan to the government. So there is a policy matrix, which includes several measures related to water sector governance and regulation. So in Mauritius, this includes the adoption of a new Water Act, which would cover regulation issues. And in this case, the focus was really to support concrete policy reforms to improve the sector governance, financial sustainability. And it did include as well quite precise targets on budget increases for the sector. So it was quite ambitious. So this is, I would say, the panel of what we can do if we want to really support this topic.
Well, thank you so much, Madeleine. So ADF is not just investing in projects in the traditional sense, but actually doing a lot of support in this kind of institutional regulatory environment improvement in this country. So very, very interesting to hear. Thanks for sharing. Now, I think we have come to the point where we can open the questions to participants who are connected online. And I think we did receive some questions already, okay, here we go. So there's one question. Let's go back to Maria, because there's one question for you. And it goes, given your dual focus on water and municipal waste at the Florence School of Regulation, is it possible to integrate the regulation of those two sectors, both water supply and waste, integrate these two sectors to increase the circular or sustainable practices?
Actually, yeah, it's a very interesting question. I have to say that so far, when I was sort of working on circular economy practices for the water sector, which I have looked at both for the water services, but also for the wastewater services. Actually, it led me to the thinking that when you develop circular economy practices in the water and wastewater sector, then you make a link between water regulation and energy regulation instead of waste regulation. Let me just say, just take you through the pathway that led me there. Basically, there is a recast of a directive that was adopted in the EU, which is called the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which is sort of promoting and trying to boost the reuse of treated wastewater. So obviously there we are into a circular economy practice, but I don't see any link, per se with the waste sector. On the other side, the same recast of the directive is asking wastewater services to reach for some of them, for the biggest of them, to reach energy neutrality, and therefore, once again, boosting circular economy practices. But then when wastewater services are going to produce energy, then sometimes they're going to use it for themselves, but sometimes they can also sell it to the grid and put it back on the market. And therefore, the link that I'm seeing, through a circular economy for the water and wastewater sector is more connected to the energy sector regulation than to the waste sector regulation per se. So that's where I stand with my thinking. But of course, this is work in progress.
Yeah. Thank you. You already mentioned this energy aspect earlier, but maybe that's the next frontier, to link with this more solid waste thing. And by the way, there was a question from Mohamed Jabir. We also have more questions. So let me turn to Sophie. We have a question from Marion Desbrochet. So she would like to know from Sophie, when you did this study that was mentioned in the initial presentation, there were also, good practices, case studies. But did you actually, at OECD, we often talk about best practices, good examples. Did you encounter any examples where the implementation of a regulatory agencies did not work? I don't know if you want to name anything, but.
Thank you for the question. I think definitely this is pointing also to the fact that the model of regulatory agencies, autonomous regulatory agencies, is increasingly being challenged and revised. So that used to be the sort of a gold standard always provided as the target, if you want, for regulation. And I think now we're moving to a concept where we look at how regulatory functions are allocated, but not necessarily mandating or recommending that they would be all concentrated in single regulatory agencies, even though the demand from countries is still focused on that. So we, as I mentioned, both in Senegal and in the Philippines, it's not the OECD that came and stated you should have a single regulatory agency. It was really the demand of government that they identified this as their target, if you want. We haven't documented per se examples where these have not worked. What we did document is the case of what in the UK, where, I wouldn't say it's a failure by any means, but as Maria was mentioning, the UK government is now reconsidering that model. One, so that the regulatory functions across economy, but also environment and drinking water can be more consolidated. So based on, following what Maria was saying, so that there is greater integration rather than coordination. And that stemmed, I think one of the trigger for this was a big increase in sewage overflows that triggered a public outcry in the UK. So that showed that effectively water companies had been under-investing in approaches to controlling and to managing these sewer overflows, leading to strong contamination in the rivers, including death in certain extreme cases. So that's what, combined with challenges on the financial viability of these utilities, led to a publication of a Cunliffe report published in July 2025 that recommended these fundamental institutional changes. And I think that's a wake-up call, and that's an interesting example to look at for the sector as a whole. I would say the other challenges is where the transition arrangements are not well thought through, or where there is a combination of regulation by contract and regulation by agency in which the responsibilities are not clear. So we didn't document that in the working paper, but I know the case of Mali, where that led to really some strong challenges and the collapse of the private sector contract, because effectively there was no clarity in terms of what was carried out by the regulator and what was carried out by the contract. Hence, the care we're taking in Senegal in advising the government to, for example, wait until the ongoing contracts are terminated so that there is a due transition that takes place. Because I think the temptation also is to allocate too many roles and functions too fast to a regulator who cannot do it all. It's not a magic wand and cannot solve all the issues, and that needs to be carried out in coordination with broader sector reforms, which is also what we advise the Filipino government to do, i.e. to move towards greater consolidation of a sector alongside the strengthening of regulatory arrangements.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for elaborating on that, Sophie. Let me now turn to Madeleine next. So France is the co-chair of the Investment for Water Interactive Dialogue under the upcoming UN Water Conference end of this year. So in that context, do you think that strengthening regulation of water and sanitation services will figure as maybe a prominent theme in this discussion upcoming in the UN Water Conference?
So thank you for this question. First, what I have to say is that how these themes will be discussed and what they will entail relies primarily with the UN and UN Water. What we see from what we have now is that there is no sign that it is a big topic which is part of this interactive dialogue. It's not something that I applaud, but this is what I see. Maybe a way we could, try to incorporate it if we wanted to, because of course it's a very important topic, would be through the issue of performance, because we see that there is a lot of insistence on private sector participation, and also operators' performance. So if you can make the case that regulation and a good regulatory system is key to performance and private sector participation, then maybe we could have it fully embarked as part of this dialogue. But for the moment, it's not clear that it will be the case.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, tying specifically to what's coming up the end of the year. I have very couple of question, and maybe I could turn to all three of you. Maybe quick reply from all of you, Sophie, Maria, and Madeleine. And it's to do with, more politics and how do we politics and the water sector. So, it's very important, but it can also be a challenge for regulatory authorities preserving institutional independence from both political influence and then as regulated entities, and how to strengthen their capacity in increasingly disruptive economic and political and climate contexts. So it's a little bit charged, but I don't know, maybe a quick thought from all three of you in this, how to make sure that regulation of the sectors will be focused on economics, efficiency, effectiveness, service provision, but it's very tempting, for political interference, especially when we talk about focused recovery, etc., and the need to help to steer and direct investment flows. So who would like to start among the three of you? Can I call on? Okay, let's go in the order of Maria, Sophie, and Madeleine.
Thank you very much, Kumi, and thank you very much for those questions. I mean, independence is a key element, and indeed, I have seen a few regulators that were created as independent that suddenly became less independent through the years because some government decided otherwise. This is, for instance, the case in Romania, where the regulator used to be funded through a fee that was collected from the operators, and suddenly this budget had to go through the national budget, and therefore the financial independence of the regulator got jeopardized because it was completely reliant on the national budget voted by the government. So I mean, this issue of independence can take various let's say patterns. In Hungary, for instance, the regulator only has a sort of a consultative opinion, and at the end of the day, it is the ministry that sets the tariffs, and the tariff hasn't evolved since 2011. So the independence and the capacity to act of the regulator is definitely jeopardized in this country. And I've seen into the chat that somebody was mentioning that in Uganda, in Africa, the government decided that the regulatory agency would go back under a ministry, a given ministry, so become a sort of unit under a ministry. So it is extremely difficult to safeguard the independence of the regulator. Of course, you can put that into the law, into the bylaws, but nevertheless, a government can overrule those laws and bylaws. A way maybe to strengthen the independence of the regulator could be for that regulator to build its capacity, its competence, and its expertise, and to build through that expertise its credibility and its effectiveness with regard to the population, when having this regulator has led to utilities performing better, and and covering more population in terms of service coverage. When the regulator can show that it has produced, a difference on the ground and improvements for the population, maybe that's the best safeguard for the independence of the regulator.
Thank you. Sophie, further thoughts?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an issue, and it's an issue we saw at play, with Maria in Senegal, in which, we did recommend that the regulator to be created by presidential decree would have responsibilities for setting tariff, but that was a kind of red line imposed by the government saying, no, it needs to remain in political hands. So I think one of the key way of addressing that is also transparency and strengthening information, which is part of, what Maria was saying in terms of demonstrating to the population that they are playing a strong role. But in the case of Senegal, when we had regulation by contract, which was well functioning until a certain point, there was a very well-designed financial models that was used in order to set tariffs based on cost recovery level that gradually improved the financial health of the sector, including of SONES, which is the asset holding company, which was able to borrow directly from AFD and from a number of international lenders on its own credit rating due to this financial strength. So what I would say is that instead of having a financial model that is behind closed door in between sort of different agents, the regulator can work on disseminating information, consulting consumers, providing a full rationale for its recommendation to the government in terms of tariff definition, which then makes it more difficult for the government to step back. However, it's entirely in their own right to set the tariff according to their priorities. Then our recommendation would be, perhaps don't make the subsidies explicit, don't do it through the water tariffs, but provide a dedicated subsidy to the poorest population. And now we have increasingly a number of tools to do this, to target those who need it most, which are also documented in the working paper in Cambodia and other places.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's turn to Madeleine now. Same question, further thoughts.
Yeah, Sophie and Maya have said it almost all. So I will just maybe mention the work that the ONG WIN, which is Water Integrity Network, is doing in several countries, including Kenya, where we supported them. And in fact, they also work with regulators to help them identify and manage integrity risks, such as regulatory capture, lack of transparency, undue influence, through tools like risk assessments, benchmarking, and what they call integrity clinics. And the idea is really that the regulators need to be robust internally in order to remain, independent externally. So, I think this is, the base for this. But evidently, if there is political will against that, it will be difficult to remain so. So, yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think, very interesting discussion. And then we have a few more, but unfortunately, it's almost the end of the hour. So first, I would like to just thank all three of you, Sophie Tremollet from OECD, and also Maria Salvetti from Florence School, and then Madeleine Portman from ADF for joining us, and then for all of you connecting and then interacting with the speakers by posing questions. And thanks to all of your work, there's a full menu, if you will, of potential options for conducting regulations for water services. And there's no single institutional model. We've heard of several. And then that's more efficient or better than the other. But in fact, each country needs to work based on the existing institutional arrangement. But at the same time, there are some common regulatory tools and instruments that can be used, especially for tariff regulations or benchmark performance, for example. So a lot of potential for lessons learned to be shared among practitioners and policymakers. Now, and also, again, this forthcoming OECD working paper that Sophie talked about, it will be officially released in May. and it should be, we hope, a valuable resource for governments and other stakeholders that are looking to design water sector regulatory reform with a view to accelerating investment, especially combined with the consolidation of services, that kind of objective as well. So please stay tuned for this paper coming up in May. And for to find more information, there is, I think somebody already put it in the chat, more information on OECD work on water can be found at oecd.org/water. So please stay tuned. Now, so again, I'm wrapping up, but I would like to invite you to stay tuned and then try to join us for the next OECD Green Talk Live, which will look at industry transformation in late April. And so please do sign up to our newsletter. It's also in the chat so that you stay informed of all the upcoming events from the OECD Green Talk Live. And again, thanks to all of you, all the panelists and speakers, and those participants online. And we hope you found the discussion useful. And until then, until next time, thank you and have a good rest of the day. Bye.